He's a mechanic, Alara. A mechanic. My mother's voice, usually modulated to a perfect drawing room pitch, was dangerously close to a shriek. The pearls at her throat seemed to vibrate with indignation. We were in the morning room, a ridiculous name for a space so grand it could have hosted a state dinner, and the morning was being thoroughly ruined. This wasn't just a casual observation, it was the opening salvo in a war I hadn't asked for, but was now fully conscripted into. The war against George, the man I loved, the man they had unanimously and vociferously declared beneath me. My father, Harrison Thorne, a man whose disapproval usually manifested as a glacial silence, was actually pacing, his bespoke shoes sinking into the antique Aubusson carpet with agitated thuds. It's not about the money, Alara, though God knows that's a concern. It's about suitability, background, the circles we move in. Think of the Thorne legacy. What would your grandfather say? The circles you move in, father, I corrected, my hands clenching in my lap, nails digging into my palms. George moves in circles where people are genuine, where they work for what they have, where they don't judge you by your damn stock portfolio or the age of your grandfather's portrait. And Grandpa, if you recall, started this legacy with his own two hands, working in a mill. A fact they conveniently chose to forget when it suited them. My sister, Clarissa, ever the parental parrot, chimed in with a sigh that could curdle milk, daintily patting her perfectly coiffed hair. Darling, be realistic. What will you talk about with his friends? Carburetors, engine displacement? And what will our friends say? The Ashworths, the Vanderbilts? They'll be aghast. Think of the embarrassment, the sheer social awkwardness. I overheard Beatrice Wellington at the club the other day asking if you'd taken leave of your senses. Even Aunt Millicent, summoned like a vulture to a potential social carcass, had fanned herself dramatically with a lace handkerchief when I first showed her a picture of George. He was sleeves rolled up, a smudge of grease on his cheek that I found endearing, grinning proudly beside a vintage Mustang he'd lovingly restored. "Oh, Alara," she'd lamented, her voice dripping with theatrical pity. "The manual labor of it all. The grime. Imagine him at the opera. Will he wear overalls?" Their words were a barrage, each one a carefully aimed dart intended to wound my love and dismantle my resolve. They saw George's profession, his lack of inherited wealth, his public school education, as insurmountable barriers, stains on the pristine canvas of the Thorne family legacy. They didn't see him, the kindness in his eyes that made strangers trust him instantly, the easy laugh that could coax a smile from a stone, the fierce intelligence he applied to everything from a sputtering engine to a philosophical debate we'd had late one night about free will. They didn't see the way he looked at me, like I was the most extraordinary person in the world, not because I was a thorn, but despite it, or perhaps because I was simply Alara. This wasn't just disapproval. It was a campaign, meticulously orchestrated, and it culminated in a formal intervention in the Oak Room of the Saint. Regis, a place usually reserved for celebrating multi-million-dollar mergers and charity galas, now the stage for my family's attempt to sever what they saw as a disastrous alliance. They thought they could break me, or at least break us. They had no idea how wrong they were. And now, looking back, the irony is so thick you could cut it with one of Mother's antique silver cake knives. Those same people who look down their patrician noses now stumble over themselves, their voices thick with feigned sincerity, begging for a forgiveness I'm still deciding if they truly deserve. The intervention was as brutal as a corporate takeover, but far more personal. Mother, resplendent in a Chanel suit that probably cost more than George's first car, laid it on thick. Happiness, Ilara, is a fleeting emotion, a youthful fancy. Stability, reputation, a certain standing in society, those are the foundations of a lasting life, a secure future for your children. She painted a grim picture of my future, one filled with social ostracization, whispered conversations behind cupped hands at the club, and doors quietly closing in my face. "You'll be a pariah, darling. Is that what you want?" Father, more direct, his voice like chipping ice, questioned George's ability to provide in the manner to which I was accustomed. "His garage, Alara, it's a small enterprise. Commendable, perhaps, in its own way, but hardly a foundation for the kind of life you deserve, the kind of life we've worked to ensure for you. He conveniently forgot that I had my own career as an art curator, my own income, my own desires that had nothing to do with his balance sheets or the size of my trust fund. Clarissa, ever the pragmatist in her own self-serving way, focused on the social death knell. Think of the invitations that will dry up, Alara, the charity boards you won't be asked to join, the difficulty of finding suitable schools for your children when their father, well, when their father is who he is. People talk, they judge. It's the way of the world, our world at least. When George finally arrived, delayed by that last-minute crisis at his garage, Mrs. Henderson's ancient, beloved Corolla refusing to start right before a crucial doctor's appointment, he walked into a frost so thick it could have preserved mammoths. He was in his usual off-duty attire, clean dark jeans that fit him well, a crisp blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing strong, capable hands, and that warm, apologetic smile that always reached his eyes. To me, he was a breath of fresh, honest air. To them, I knew he was Exhibit A in their case against my sanity. "Sorry I'm late, everyone," he'd said, his gaze finding mine, offering a silent reassurance that spoke volumes. "Emergency at the shop." Mrs. Henderson was quite beside herself. My family exchanged glances that screamed, "See? Unreliable, common, consorting with the hoi polloi." The interrogation continued, but George met their thinly veiled insults and loaded questions with a quiet dignity that was far more impressive than any of their inherited bluster. He spoke of his business with pride, not arrogance, explaining the satisfaction of diagnosing a tricky problem or seeing a customer drive away happy. He spoke of his feelings for me with a sincerity that should have shamed them, his gaze soft when he looked my way. It didn't. "We just want you to be sure, darling," Mother had said, her voice dripping with false concern, like honey laced with arsenic. "This isn't some youthful rebellion, is it? You're not trying to make a point? To shock us?" Make a point? The only point I wanted to make was that I loved George, and their approval, while once something I might have craved as a younger, more pliable daughter, was no longer a prerequisite for my happiness. My spine stiffened. "The only point I'm making, Mother, is that I've found someone who makes me incredibly happy, someone I respect and admire, and I intend to marry him." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Aunt Millicent's faint, scandalized gasp. When we left the St. Regis, the bustling New York City air felt like a reprieve, a cleansing breath after the suffocating atmosphere of the Oak Room. George let out a long, slow whistle. "Well," he said, that familiar wry grin spreading across his face, "I don't think I'll be invited to the family polo match anytime soon. Or ever." Tears I'd been holding back with sheer willpower finally spilled, hot and angry. "George, I'm so sorry. They're impossible, prejudiced, awful." He pulled me close, right there on the busy sidewalk, his arms strong and comforting. "Hey, it's them, not you, not us. We knew this wouldn't be a walk in the park. But their park? Honestly, Alara, it looks a bit boring, all manicured lawns and keep off the grass signs. I prefer a place where you can get your hands dirty." His ability to find humor, to lighten the heaviest moments, was one of the million reasons I loved him. We decided on a small wedding, an intimate ceremony at a charming little vineyard upstate, owned by a college friend of George's. It was the antithesis of the grand, society weddings my family usually orchestrated and attended. The invitations, simple and elegant, went out. Clarissa pleaded a prior unbreakable engagement to a spa weekend in Aspen I knew she'd booked only after receiving our invitation. Aunt Millicent simply ignored it, later claiming it must have gotten lost in the post. My parents, however, responded with chilling efficiency via their lawyer. The thick, creamy envelope didn't contain well wishes or an RSVP. It contained a prenuptial agreement, drafted with the precision of a military campaign, designed to shield every last Thorne family asset, down to the antique silverware, from the perceived threat of the gold-digging mechanic. I stared at the document, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes, a cold knot of betrayal tightening in my stomach. "They can't be serious," I whispered, handing it to George. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable at first. Then a flicker of genuine hurt, quickly masked, crossed his features. It was a look I'd rarely seen on his usually open face, and it pierced me to the core. They really think that's all I see in you? A bank account? George, no, this is them, not me. You don't have to sign this. We don't need their money, I said, my voice choked with a mixture of anger and shame at my family's callousness. He laid the document on our small kitchen table, his gaze steady on mine. No, it does matter, Alara, he said quietly but firmly. It matters that you know it's not true. It matters that I'm marrying you, for your brilliant mind, your kind heart, your terrible singing in the shower, all of it. A small smile touched his lips. I'll sign it. I'll sign 100 of these if it makes them leave you in peace, even if they'll never believe I love you for you and not for Thorn Industries. He picked up the pen I'd let fall from numb fingers and signed his name with a firm, steady hand, a quiet act of defiance against their cynicism. In that moment, my love for him, already so vast, deepened into something unshakable. Our wedding day was perfect, bathed in the golden light of late autumn, the air crisp and smelling of ripe grapes and wood smoke. Surrounded by a small group of our dearest friends, people who saw us, celebrated us, without reservation, we exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. His were full of humor and heartfelt promises that made me cry. Mine, I hoped, conveyed even a fraction of the love and respect I felt for him. My parents' absence was a tangible shadow, a silent rebuke that echoed in the spaces where they should have been. But George's presence, his hand warm and steady in mine, his eyes shining with love, was the sun that banished those shadows. We danced under the stars, drank local wine, and laughed until our sides ached. It was real, it was joyful, and it was entirely ours. Life unfolded with a quiet, unassuming beauty. My curatorial work at the small, independent gallery was challenging and fulfilling, a world away from the sterile corporate art collections my mother favored. George's garage, Oakhaven Auto Repair, became a local institution. He wasn't just known for his fair prices and uncanny ability to diagnose any mechanical ailment. He was known for his honesty, his willingness to explain things in layman's terms, and the way he'd go the extra mile, like staying late to fix a single mom's car so she could get to work the next day. We bought a charming, slightly ramshackle house on the edge of town with a sprawling, overgrown garden that we slowly, lovingly began to tame together. George, with his capable hands and seemingly endless patience, taught me how to prune roses and build raised beds for vegetables. We adopted Axel, a scruffy terrier mix from the local shelter, whose boundless enthusiasm and penchant for stealing socks filled our home with a different kind of chaotic joy. There was an easy rhythm to our days, filled with shared laughter over breakfast, quiet evenings reading side by side on our worn sofa, and the comforting knowledge that we were building something real, something lasting, something entirely ours. The silence from my family was a dull ache, a constant reminder of their disapproval, but the vibrancy of my life with George, the sheer, unadulterated happiness I found in our shared world, dulled its edge. I made a few tentative attempts to bridge the chasm, phone calls that went to voicemail, polite invitations to dinner that were met with equally polite, vague refusals. Eventually, I stopped. The pain of their rejection was still there, but it no longer defined me. Then Hurricane Ophelia hit. It wasn't a distant news story, it was a monstrous, churning beast that clawed its way up the coast, heading directly for our region. The warnings grew more dire with each passing hour. We boarded up the windows of our little house, secured what we could in the garden, and helped our elderly neighbors, the Petersons, do the same. The wind began to howl like a banshee, and the rain came down in sheets so dense it was like living underwater. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity, a terrifying symphony of shrieking wind, crashing trees, and the relentless, drumming rain. When it finally passed, leaving an eerie, bruised silence in its wake, it revealed a landscape of utter devastation. Trees were down everywhere, their massive roots ripped from the saturated earth. Power lines snaked across roads like fallen black serpents. The river that bordered Oakhaven, usually a placid ribbon of blue, had transformed into a raging brown torrent, breaching its banks and inundating homes and businesses in the lower parts of town. Our house, thankfully, perched on a slight rise, was mostly spared, with only a lost chimney pot and a thoroughly traumatized Axel cowering under the bed. But the community, our community, was reeling, battered and shocked. And in the midst of that chaos, George shone. His garage, Oakhaven Auto Repair, situated on slightly higher ground and built like a fortress, became an impromptu hub of the recovery effort. He had 2 heavy-duty generators, a full workshop of tools, his trusty tow truck, and an inexhaustible supply of calm competence. For days, he worked virtually non-stop, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and an unwavering determination to help. I'd never seen him like this, so focused, so driven, yet still so compassionate. He used his tow truck, equipped with a powerful winch, to clear roads of fallen trees and debris, creating pathways for emergency vehicles. He got generators running for the local clinic, which had lost power while treating minor injuries, and for elderly residents whose medication required refrigeration. He even managed to jury-rig a temporary water pump for the volunteer fire department when their main pump failed during a crucial moment while they were trying to prevent a fire from spreading in a damaged building. He organized small teams of volunteers, his quiet authority naturally drawing people to him. He coordinated with the overwhelmed emergency services, providing a vital link between official channels and the immediate needs on the ground. He didn't just fix cars, he was helping to fix a broken town. He never complained about the exhaustion that etched lines around his eyes, never flagged in his efforts. He just did what needed to be done. I worked beside him as much as I could, helping to organize the donations of food, water, and blankets that started trickling in, checking on vulnerable neighbors, ferrying messages through the disrupted communication lines. I saw the respect he commanded, the profound gratitude in people's eyes when he arrived, like a muddy, grease-stained knight, to solve a problem they'd thought insurmountable. One afternoon, helping him inventory precious cans of fuel for the borrowed generators, I watched him patiently explain to an anxious young mother, whose baby was coughing in the damp, chilly air of the temporary shelter, how to safely operate the small generator unit he'd just managed to procure and set up for her. His gentleness, his practicality, his innate desire to ease suffering, it was all just George. He was more than just a mechanic. He was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the desolation. A news crew from a regional station eventually made their way into Oakhaven, documenting the devastation and the burgeoning recovery efforts. They did a segment on the local heroes who had stepped up. George, looking tired but resolute, a smudge of grease artfully highlighting his cheekbone, was featured prominently. They interviewed Mrs. Henderson, who tearfully recounted how George had not only fixed her Corolla just before the storm, but had also checked on her repeatedly afterwards, bringing her hot soup and ensuring her generator stayed fueled. They called him the guardian angel of Oakhaven's gears, or some such dramatic, slightly embarrassing media title. The first call was from Clarissa. Her voice, when I finally got a patch of decent cell signal, was strained, almost hesitant. "Ilara, is that you? Are you safe?" "Yes, Clarissa, we're okay. Shaken, like everyone, but okay." We saw the news," she said, a strange note in her voice. "About George, about what he's doing down there. It's quite something, isn't he?" The grudging admiration was unmistakable, a crack in her carefully constructed facade of disdain. "Father is trying to get through to the local authorities to see if Thorn Industries can send aid." A few days later, as the immediate crisis began to subside and the long, arduous process of rebuilding commenced, my father's sleek black town car, looking absurdly out of place amidst the muddy tracks, piles of debris, and general air of organized chaos, pulled up in front of George's garage. He stepped out, his expensive suit looking rumpled, his usually immaculate shoes coated in a fine layer of dust. He looked older, more tired than I remembered, the lines of worry etched deeper around his eyes. He just stood there for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the hive of activity. Volunteers sorting donations, George conferring with a group of electricians about restoring power to a block of houses, the constant hum of generators providing a soundtrack to the recovery. George, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, saw him. He straightened up, his expression neutral, watchful. I walked over to stand beside him, a protective instinct flaring. "Mr. Thorne," George said, his voice even, betraying nothing. My father's gaze swept over George, really seeing him, perhaps for the first time, taking in the grime, the exhaustion, the quiet authority he commanded. It was a long, silent assessment. "George," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was no condescension in his tone when he addressed my husband, just a kind of weary acknowledgement, perhaps even a dawning respect. Your mother and we've been worried sick. The news reports, they don't paint the full picture, I imagine?" "We're managing, Father," I said, my voice cooler than I intended. Years of accumulated hurt simmered just beneath the surface. "So I see," Father replied, his eyes still on George. He gestured vaguely at the organized chaos around the garage. "This is impressive. Truly impressive." George just nodded. "People helping people, Mr. Thorne. It's what you do when things get tough." "Indeed," Father murmured. He cleared his throat, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Your mother, she's at the community center, the one they've set up as a temporary shelter. She insisted on coming down. She brought some supplies from the city, blankets, canned goods, that sort of thing." My mother? At a disaster shelter? Volunteering? Handing out blankets? The image was so incongruous it was almost comical. Mother, whose idea of charity was writing a substantial check at a glittering gala and ensuring her name was prominently displayed on the donor list, was in the thick of it. "She wants to see you, Alara," Father said, finally looking directly at me. His gaze was softer than I'd seen it in years. "And we need to talk. All of us." The community center, usually a place for town meetings and bingo nights, was a cacophony of noise, desperation, and the smell of damp clothes and disinfectant. Cots lined the gymnasium floor, families huddled together, their faces etched with worry and loss. And there, in the middle of it all, looking utterly out of her element yet strangely determined, was my mother. She wasn't wearing her usual designer attire, but practical slacks and a simple blouse that was already smudged with dirt. Her perfectly styled hair was tied back in a makeshift ponytail, and there was a streak of something that looked suspiciously like mud on her cheek. She was handing out blankets from a large box, her movements surprisingly efficient, if a little stiff and unused to such physical exertion. She saw us, and her face, usually a carefully composed mask of aristocratic poise, crumpled. Not in disdain, as I was so accustomed to, but in something that looked remarkably like shame and relief. She rushed towards us, her composure, for once, completely gone. "Alara, oh Alara, thank God." She pulled me into an awkward, uncharacteristic hug, her grip surprisingly strong. Then she turned to George, who stood beside me, his expression calm but observant. "George," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, I, I've been so wrong." Actual tears welled in her eyes, a sight I never thought I'd witness. "What you've done here, for these people, for this town, it's—" She struggled for words, her usual eloquence failing her. "It's extraordinary. We saw the reports, but seeing you—" George, ever gracious, simply said, "Anyone would have done the same, Mrs. Thorne. People were in trouble." "No," she insisted, shaking her head vehemently, the gesture dislodging a stray strand of hair that fell across her forehead. "No, not everyone. We judged you so harshly, so unfairly." She looked from George to me, her gaze pleading, stripped of all its former hauteur. "We were blinded by such foolish, superficial things, by pride, by snobbery. Over the next few hours, as we found a quiet corner amidst the controlled chaos, the full story unfolded. The news report hadn't just been a local broadcast, it had been picked up by national outlets, eager for uplifting stories amidst the disaster coverage. The tale of the selfless mechanic and his Herculean efforts had resonated widely. Friends of my parents, the same ones who had whispered and gossiped about my unsuitable marriage, had been calling them. Not with derision or pity for their fallen daughter, but with admiration for their son-in-law. The Ashworths, whose prized antique collection, stored in their riverside summer home, had been saved from certain flood damage by a series of strategically placed sandbags and a powerful sump pump George had managed to get running just in the nick of time after their own generator failed. The Worthingtons, whose elderly, frail matriarch had been personally evacuated by George in his high-clearance tow truck when the waters rose with terrifying speed around her isolated cottage. These were the stories filtering back to my parents, painting a picture of George that was impossible to reconcile with their preconceived notions of a mere grease monkey. But it wasn't just the public praise from their peers, though that had clearly shaken them. It was seeing the raw footage on television, the sheer scale of the devastation, the desperation in people's faces, and George's unwavering, calm commitment in the midst of it all. It was realizing that the qualities they professed to value, resilience, leadership, integrity, a willingness to serve others, were embodied not by the pedigreed, silver-spooned scions they'd envisioned for me, but by the very man they had so readily and cruelly dismissed. Their carefully constructed world of social hierarchies and material worth had been rocked to its foundations by the simple, undeniable truth of a good man's character. That evening, after another long, exhausting day of cleanup and coordination, my parents, Clarissa, who had arrived with Mother, looking subdued and genuinely concerned, George and I sat in the small, slightly battered kitchen of our home. The power was still out in our section of town, so we ate by the flickering light of candles, sandwiches made from donated bread and peanut butter, and lukewarm canned soup, a far cry from the catered dinners and fine wines of their world. Axel lay at George's feet, occasionally thumping his tail, content to have his people together. "We owe you an apology, George," Father began, his voice heavy, devoid of its usual authoritative boom. He looked directly at George, his gaze unwavering. "A profound one. We misjudged you. We misjudged your character, your worth, your everything. We did so based on the most shallow, indefensible criteria. We valued the wrong things, Alara. We taught you to value the wrong things. We were snobs," Clarissa stated bluntly, looking down at her chipped nail polish, a far cry from her usual immaculate manicure. She looked genuinely contrite, her eyes red-rimmed. "Horrible, judgmental snobs. I was awful to you, Alara, pushing you towards men I thought were suitable, but who were frankly empty shells compared to George. And I was dismissive and rude to you, George, from the moment I met you. I'm truly, deeply sorry." Mother reached across the small, cluttered table and, hesitantly, placed her hand over George's, which was resting near his soup bowl. Her hand, usually adorned with expensive rings, was bare and looked surprisingly work-worn. It was a gesture so unexpected, so out of character, that it silenced us all for a moment. "We thought we were protecting Alara," she said, her voice trembling, the candlelight catching the sheen of fresh tears on her cheeks. "Protecting our family's name, our legacy. We were so afraid of what people would think, so caught up in appearances. We didn't realize that true legacy isn't about wealth or social standing or ancient names. It's about character. It's about what you do for others when no one is looking, or when everyone is. You've shown us that, George. You, the man we so arrogantly said was beneath our daughter, have shown us what true worth, true nobility looks like." Tears streamed down her face now, unchecked, dripping onto the worn linoleum tabletop. "Can you ever forgive us? Alara, can you? For the years of coldness, for the judgment, for not being there on your wedding day, for all of it?" I looked at George. His expression was gentle, understanding. There was no trace of bitterness, no smug "I told you so" in his eyes. Only compassion and a quiet strength that had seen us through so much. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent signal of support, leaving the decision, the words, to me. Forgiveness. It was a complex, tangled thing. Years of hurt, of feeling dismissed and unloved for my choices, of seeing the pain my family's rejection caused George couldn't be erased in a single candlelit evening, no matter how sincere their apologies seemed. But looking at my family, stripped of their pretenses, their arrogance washed away by a tide of humility and genuine remorse, I saw a flicker of hope, a possibility of rebuilding something, perhaps something stronger and more honest than what we'd had before. It's going to take time, I said slowly, my voice honest, a little shaky. You hurt us deeply, both of us. The things you said, the way you acted, that doesn't just disappear overnight. We know, Father said, his gaze downcast, his shoulders slumped. And we deserve it. We don't expect miracles. We will do whatever it takes, for as long as it takes, to earn back your trust, Alara, and your respect, George, if you'll allow us to try. The surprise wasn't just their apology, as astonishing as that was. It was the depth of their remorse, the genuine shift in their perspective, forced upon them by circumstances they couldn't control, but embraced, it seemed, with a sincerity I hadn't thought them capable of. It was the dawning realization in their eyes that the world was bigger, and human worth measured differently than their exclusive circles had ever taught them. A few weeks later, a different kind of envelope arrived. Not from a lawyer, but handwritten on my mother's personal cream-colored stationery. It was an invitation, not to a gala or a society dinner or some stuffy family obligation, but to a simple Sunday brunch at their home in the city. No agenda, it read in my mother's elegant script. Just family, if you'll have us. We'll understand if it's too soon. George and I talked about it. It's a start, I guess, he said, looking at the invitation. Are you ready for that? I don't know, I admitted, but maybe we should try. So we went. It was awkward at first, stilted conversations, moments of uncomfortable silence where the ghosts of past grievances seemed to hover in the air. But there was an effort, a genuine desire to connect, that was new and fragile. My father asked George about the garage, not with disdain or feigned interest, but with actual curiosity, listening intently as George described the challenges of sourcing rare parts for vintage cars. He even, to my utter astonishment, suggested some business contacts who specialized in logistics, thinking they might be helpful for George's parts suppliers. George politely declined, wanting to maintain his hard-won independence, a decision my father, surprisingly, respected with a nod. My mother, instead of critiquing my outfit or my life choices, asked about our garden and even showed me a struggling rose bush in her own manicured city terrace, asking for George's advice on how to save it. Clarissa, of all people, seemed to have undergone the most visible transformation. She talked about volunteering at a local animal shelter, admitting sheepishly that George's community spirit during the hurricane had sort of rubbed off on her. She even engaged George in a surprisingly knowledgeable conversation about classic rock music, a shared interest I never knew they had. The biggest surprise, however, came a few months after that. Thorne Industries, my father's company, had always made large charitable donations, often to high-profile, somewhat impersonal causes that garnered good press. After the hurricane, my father announced a new, deeply personal initiative, the Thorne Foundation for Community Resilience. Its first major project? A significant multi-year investment in Oak Haven and other small towns in the region that had been affected by the storm, funding rebuilding efforts, supporting small businesses with grants and low-interest loans, and establishing community-led emergency preparedness programs. And who did he ask to be on the advisory board, to help direct those funds where they were most needed, to provide on-the-ground expertise and ensure the money wasn't wasted on bureaucratic overhead? George. He was hesitant at first, genuinely surprised by the offer. I'm just a mechanic, Mr. Thorne, he'd said, when my father approached him. I don't know anything about running a foundation. You're much more than that, George, my father had replied, a newfound, genuine respect in his voice that still sometimes startled me. You're a leader. You're a problem solver, and you know what these communities need far better than any of us city folks sitting in a boardroom. We need your practical wisdom, your integrity. George accepted, not for the prestige or the connection to Thorne Industries, but because he genuinely wanted to help, because he saw it as an opportunity to make a real, lasting difference in the lives of people who had suffered. He brought his practical, no-nonsense approach to the board meetings, often cutting through the corporate jargon and endless presentations to get to the heart of the matter. He advocated for the little guy, for the projects that might not be glamorous but would make a tangible difference in people's daily lives, like funding for better drainage systems to prevent future flooding or grants for local tradespeople to train apprentices. He even convinced the board to invest in a mobile veterinary clinic for rural areas, remembering the plight of pets and livestock during Ophelia. My family didn't magically transform into saints overnight. There were still moments of ingrained snobbery, occasional tactless comments that Clarissa would quickly apologize for with a self-deprecating grimace, or my mother would visibly cringe at her own words, a blush rising on her cheeks. But there was a palpable change, a fundamental shift in their attitudes and priorities. They were trying, they were listening, they were learning. They started visiting Oakhaven more often, not just for stilted family occasions, but sometimes just to have coffee with us, or to see how a particular foundation project was progressing. My father even spent a Saturday morning at George's garage, fascinated, watching him meticulously rebuild an engine, asking surprisingly insightful questions. The begging for forgiveness wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing process, woven into their actions, their words, their willingness to see the world and the people in it differently. They saw George not as the man who was beneath me, but as the man who had, in many ways, risen above them all, showing them what truly mattered, what endured when fortunes failed or storms raged. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a year after the hurricane, we were all at my parents' estate for Thanksgiving. The sprawling grounds were immaculate, the house filled with the warm, comforting scent of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, and cinnamon-spiced apple pie. George was outside on the great lawn, patiently showing my young nephew, Thomas, Clarissa's son, the engine of his beloved, and now famously resilient, tow truck, his explanations simple and engaging, his laughter mingling with the boys' excited chatter. My father stood on the terrace watching them, a small, almost imperceptible smile on his face, a look of quiet contentment I hadn't seen in him for many years. Mother came to stand beside me, handing me a glass of warm, spiced cider. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, painting the scene in hues of gold and amber. "He's wonderful with Thomas," she said softly, her gaze fixed on George and her grandson. "So patient, so kind." "He's wonderful with everyone, Mom," I replied, my heart full, a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the cider. She squeezed my arm, her grip gentle but firm. "We were such fools, Alara, such blind, arrogant fools." Her eyes, for once, held no judgment, no calculation, only a profound, lingering regret and a touch of something else. Gratitude. "We almost lost you, lost the chance to know this incredible man, because we couldn't see past our own ridiculous prejudices." She paused, her voice barely a whisper, raw with emotion. "Thank you for not giving up on him. And," she turned to look at me fully, her eyes shining, "thank you for, eventually, not giving up on us." I looked out at George, his easy laughter carrying on the breeze as he effortlessly lifted Thomas into the truck's cab, and then at my mother, her face open and vulnerable in a way I never thought possible. The path had been unexpectedly rocky, full of judgments and pronouncements, interventions and icy silences, storms both literal and metaphorical. But the surprise wasn't that they had been wrong about George. The surprise was that they had, in the end, found the courage to admit it, to dismantle their own ivory towers of prejudice, and in doing so, had opened the door for a different kind of family, one built not on pedigree or perception, but on something far more real, far more resilient. Something perhaps that George, with his steady hands and even steadier heart, had quietly, patiently taught us all.